On Vimy Ridge in northern France, on the 250 acres given to Canada, stands a soaring monument designed by Canadian architect and sculptor Walter Allward. It reflects the grief, loss, and horror of war. Vimy Ridge was regarded as crucial in World War I, and the Canadian forces managed to win the high ground and tenaciously hold on to it. There were 4 divisions from every part of Canada, from coast to coast to coast, fighting side by side, and the guide from Parks Canada told us with some pride that Vimy was crucial in creating a sense of national identity and national unity. It was Canada's defining moment. But there have been other pivotal events, both good and bad, in the history of Canada. Let us not forget 1867, for example, the year of Confederation, or the discovery of insulin by Banting and Best, and their giving away the patent to the world for free, unlike today when drug companies may well be selling their COVID vaccines for a handsome profit. We remember the horror of residential schools and the delivery of universal health care. These are events which are pivotal in our history and make us who we are. For the people of Israel, the Exodus and the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea were defining moments in their faith and nationhood. The event gave them the conviction that they were God's people and God was on their side. Pharaoh, fickle man that he was bent on power and wealth, but the horrifying plagues, and especially the death of his firstborn child, had persuaded him that it was time to let these slaves go. He had had enough of their Hebrew God, and he summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night and ordered them out of Egypt and to take with them the God which was theirs. We're not sure exactly how much time had elapsed, but Pharaoh and his advisors evidently changed their mind. What is this we have done, that we have allowed Israel to go free? It is hard to give up a place of privilege and position, and we understand why there was a civil war in the U.S. over the emancipation of slaves and the enormous amount of income and money they represented. We understand why it is so hard to honor the binding treaties we made with the First Nations of Canada. We said to them, "Give us your land and give us safe passage, and we will share our profits with you." And we have not kept up our end of the bargain. And they are, to us, in the words of Thomas King, the inconvenient Indian, and their lingering presence is an embarrassment, and we owe them so much of our income. For the Egyptians, it was impossible for them to give up all those servants and slaves who did all the heavy lifting. And the world's greatest army, for the world's most powerful nation of the day, made ready for combat. The chariots of war were greased for speed, and the footmen donned their glistening armor. Not only did they want their slaves back, they were intent on payback for all they had suffered. When there is wounded pride and rage, there is no limit to the violence. On the other side, the untrained mob of Israelites were trapped. They were a dysfunctional ragtag mob, uneducated and untrained in the art of war. In front of them was the vast expanse of the Red Sea. On either side were towering cliffs and mountainsides, and they had nowhere to go. In a few days, they would either be dead or be herded like sheep and be back building pyramids and sphinxes. And there was fear and agitation. Some said, "Let us go back. Better be a slave than dead." Others looked around to see who they could blame. Dysfunctional groups, organizations, institutions, churches. They ask, who is at fault? Who can we blame? And the Israelites turned on Moses. Some wished they could run and hide, but there was no place to go, and they were feeling trapped, and all hope was gone. When I was younger, starting out in ministry, I used to read a lot of books by Clovis Chappell, a wonderful Southern preacher. He said once he would like to preach a series of sermons on the theme, But God. But God. God's amazing interventions. It seemed that all was lost, but God. It seemed that I was all alone, but God. There was a strange presence, and I knew I was not alone. Someone said of their experience, there was no incredible miracle, but things changed, and I knew it was God. In that setting of impossible desperation, God acted. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord sent, it says in Scripture, a strong east wind and parted the waters so that his people might walk over on dry land. Was it a frothing tower of water 50 feet high, as in the 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston? And if that's what you like to believe, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. And that may be a comfort to you. But there are other options as well. Other options which are just as possible. As it was stated in Scripture, there was an east wind. And let's take into account tides as well. Those kind of factors are not quite as dramatic, but they're just as credible. For 8 years, when we lived on the shores of the eastern Atlantic Ocean on the Fundy Shore, that shoreline has the highest tides in the world, reaching 50 or 55 feet. And when the tides come in, the waters race in at between 40 and 50 kilometers an hour. And if you think you can sprint out of the way of that pounding water, well, you don't have a chance. There are some who go rafting on zodiacs, on the waves of the incoming tide, and that kind of sport is not for the faint of heart. However you look at it, there was a miracle of God's timing, and the people of Israel swarmed across that opening when it was dry, and when the Egyptian army followed, the wheels of their chariots were clogged with mud as the waters came surging back. Pharaoh's armies were drowned, and their bloated bodies were found stretched along the shoreline. We started by talking about defining moments, and this was Israel's defining moment. All through history, this is the story that would be told. In the Jewish Seder Supper, there's a special place for the escape from Egypt. It was their defining moment. And there are defining moments for individuals as well. For Moses, it was as he stood barefoot on the plains of Midian, and he saw a bush burning with flames, but not consumed. God was calling him, a fugitive from Egyptian justice, to go back to Pharaoh and set his people free. For Elijah, it was when he thundered at the priests of Baal, and God responded with fire and lightning. For Paul, it was on the Damascus road, when his house when his horse reared in fright, and in the bright light he encountered Jesus Christ. For Martin Luther, it was when he nailed his 95 Theses on the cathedral doors in Wittenberg. Or perhaps it was that moment when he stood before the princes of the region and the emissaries of the Pope, and he cried out, "Here I stand, I can do no other. So help me God." How was it for you? Perhaps it was that moment when as a teenager you huddled with others around a campfire, and you stared at the glowing coals and you edged closer to each other because of the cool evening breeze, and someone sang Kumbaya, and you decided to be a follower of Jesus. So long ago, a different world, a different time. I hope you've grown in your understanding of what it means to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ. But that August evening at camp was for you a defining moment, a pivot point in your life. But defining moments or pivotal points only describe the direction you're going to take. And what direction is that for you these days, in the midst of the complex issues of our time? Where would Jesus have you be? In these times, we hear a great deal about racism. It is one of the big issues of our time. Driving down on Westmount last week near Glasgow, I saw a large sign, an acrostic on a front lawn. Down one side was the word brown, and the B connected across with the word black, and the last letter N in brown connected with the N in indigenous, and in the middle of the sign were the words "Lives Matter." Black, brown, indigenous, lives matter. Do these signs and protests make any difference? Said one politician south of the border. America will never overcome its racism. Racism is as American as apple pie. Canada, of course, is far more discreet and polite, but rife with racist attitudes. Is there any hope for North America? Is there any hope that there can be change in our land? Is it worth trying to make a difference? Do you remember Václav Havel? He was that poet who led a revolution which toppled Soviet rule in Czechoslovakia, and he became the head of that country. He said, "Hope is working for something, not because it will succeed, but because it is right." Will you work toward making our world Christ's kind of world? Consider being an ally on the side of what is right and just and fair and true. Will you be an ally of the browns and blacks and indigenous people of our country? It means you'll study their history and issues and stand up for their rights and welfare. They need that kind of help now. What else do we face? We're on the cusp of children going back to school. Perhaps parents will hug their children and hold on to them just a little more tightly than they ever did. There is fear of COVID, and we cannot minimize that. In our kind of world, horrible things happen. Babies die. Mothers get cancer. Parents abuse children. A deranged relative in Oshawa goes on a killing spree. There's a massive explosion in Beirut. And poor, innocent people are left homeless and have their lives changed forever. As people of faith who have perhaps experienced the intrusions of God into our world in defining moments or pivotal moments, what is your response of faith? Sometimes our response must be mundane and quite ordinary. Be informed about what the experts have to say about our virus. Resolve to be compliant. Be a good citizen. Then again, you might acknowledge your fears. Let God know where you're at. Tell Him about your troubles, your fears, your anxieties. Cast your cares upon Him, says Scripture, for He cares for you. We've talked about defining moments. Your defining moment as a Christian may not lead to anything grand and mighty, but something simple and practical and doable in these days of the COVID. For a start, you can pick up the phone and call someone who is alone and isolated. I remember as a young man stepping out into the world, thinking I was destined for great things. And now I appreciate much more the words of a saintly woman. Not all of us can do great things, but we can do small things with great love. And that is the way of Christ.